Well, you can probably tell that I'm English from my accent, although I've lived here for 31 years. And so when I grew up in England, World War II was everywhere. It was movies, every Remembrance Day, 11th of November. It was part of the culture. And so I became a journalist, and I discovered that I could actually get paid a little bit for doing stories about guys that had actually been there in World War II. And I started that 30 years ago. And here I am now after 12 books that I've written about World War II, talking to you at the National World War II Memorial. Well, I've written more about the Army, the US Army, in the European theatre, in basically Europe, than any other subject. And it would be very difficult for me to pick just one story. But a favourite of mine is The Bedford Boys. It's a book I wrote about a small community in Virginia. The town is today Bedford, Virginia. And in World War II, on D-Day, 6th of June 1944, that small community lost 19 guys on Omaha Beach, which made that the highest per capita Allied sacrifice of any country that fought in World War II on our side. And so I wrote a book about that sacrifice. I got to meet a lot of the widows, some of the veterans, the families in that small community in Virginia. And it really brought home to me how even very small communities right across this great nation gave an enormous amount, so that Europe today, 81 years later, after D-Day, could be in freedom, could enjoy peace and democracy. That sacrifice of American lives in Europe in World War II gave me the life that I've had. Bedford is in Bedford County, Virginia, and in the 1930s it had a National Guard unit, A Company of the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 29th Division eventually. And so anybody that wanted to join the National Guard joined A Company in Bedford, Virginia. And so guys joined to put food on the table because rural America was desperately poor during the Great Depression. They were patriotic too. They got $1 every time they turned up for a drill practice. They liked hanging out with their buddies. They went on, weekend jaunts. It seemed like a lot of fun and a way to hang out with their friends and also serve their community and their country. But not one of them that joined A Company in Bedford in the 1930s thought that they would be in the first wave on June the 6th, 1944, in the most critical invasion in history. They have no idea. So on June the 6th, 1944, D-Day as we know it, out of A Company that landed on Omaha Beach, out of 180 guys, there were still 34 men from this town of 3,000. And out of the 34 men who landed in the first wave, the only men to land exactly at the right place at the right time on Omaha Beach, out of those 34, 19 were killed in about 15-20 minutes. So for people who've seen that great movie Saving Private Ryan, the first 20 minutes of that movie recreate what happened to the Bedford Boys. So it's a story that inspired movies. It's a very powerful story because it shows you that one small town made an enormous sacrifice, not only for Americans, but for people like me in Europe who hadn't even been born. I'm a generation that wasn't, as you can tell, I wasn't around in 1944. I was born in 1966. But these guys, that some of them have never even been to sea, never crossed an ocean. They were virgins, some of them, and hadn't seen anything of life. They gave their lives so that I could enjoy the life that I've had, and I'm 59 years old, and I'll be eternally grateful. Well, I was very affected by the Bedford Boys, the research and writing that, because I dealt with a lot of people that were still in grief. And I researched that book in the early 2000s, just after 9/11. And in fact, the reason why Bedford became a story across the United States was because there was only one community in the United States that suffered that kind of loss on one day that New York did on September the 11th. And so the New York Times actually sent a reporter to Bedford to ask them questions about, what does it feel like to be like New York? We can't find another example of a community in the United States that had such a huge loss on one day. So it was interesting for me, and it was very powerful for me to understand that even over 60 years after World War II, There were people who still really grieved the loss in World War II. There were widows that I interviewed that cried in front of me, relatives that cried still over 60 years later. Imagine a community of 3,000 people, and on one day you lose 19 of your best. They all knew each other, they were all related in some ways to each other. There were 4 sets of brothers in those 19 guys. They were more cousins than I could count. They'd all been to the same high school, they'd even dated the same sets of sisters, they played on the same baseball team. It was literally a band of brothers. And so I was impacted by the sense of loss still 60 years later. And we often forget that our freedom is bought at a price. The freedoms that most of us take way too much for granted have been bought by other people's sacrificing their blood. This country was born out of revolution, out of combat, out of fighting for independence, for a republic. And I think that the longer that we go into the future, the more that we should remind ourselves that democracy is a fragile thing. It's a rare thing in human history. It's relatively new. We have to work hard and we have to be vigilant all the time to not only strengthen democracy at home, but also to protect it and to help those who want to become democratic. Because living in a democracy is the best form of life for people on this planet. It's not a perfect system, as Churchill said. It's not the best way to live that you can imagine, but it's the best of all the alternatives. And so we have to constantly be vigilant. I remember interviewing a French D-Day veteran, a guy that had actually liberated his own country on D-Day. And his lesson, he said that his lesson for me and everybody else, people watching, is that we have to be always vigilant. We have to have a strong defense. We have to have the best army we can possibly have. We have to train it. We have to make sure it's always ready for the next threat. We have to predict the next threat. And we have to be as strong as we possibly can be to deter other people from ever thinking that they can threaten our way of life. The way that you stop people from attacking you, you stop people from even threatening you, is to be as strong as you possibly can and let other people know that you will defend your own democracy and other democracies around the world. I think the hardest part for me has always been trying to find a subject that felt new, because World War II is probably the most written about history subject. It's very difficult to come up with a new angle for a big story like D-Day. There have been thousands of books written about D-Day. So finding a new angle is really quite difficult. 20 years ago when I really got into this, there were lots of veterans still alive. And literally I would go through a phone book, I would be able to talk to people one after the other. And now there's hardly anybody left alive. So you had 16 million Americans served in World War II in the armed forces, and less than 70,000 are now alive. So it's less than 1% of World War II veterans are still alive. And so it gets very difficult to go and meet people and talk to people who are actually there during these amazing events during World War II. So I'm spending a lot more time in the archives. It's fun because you make really amazing discoveries if you put the hours in. But I always prefer face-to-face interviews with people who were there. Well, if you look just behind you, I mean, it's not on camera right now, but I'm sure that you'll give it a really good panning shot later on. But that's the Wall of Freedom, we call it. And those stars each represent an enormous amount of lost American lives. They're gold stars. And so I think that what's really powerful about this memorial is not only where it's placed, between the Lincoln Memorial here and the Washington Memorial over there, right at the heart of Washington, DC. But I think it's also important that it represents sacrifice, but it's also a celebration of what America achieved in World War II. And I think that we often forget just how much was done so quickly. Literally from December 7th, 1944 until August of 1945, in just 4 years, the span of a presidency, this country went from being a major world player to being the predominant global superpower. The largest navy, the biggest economy, controlling most of world trade. It was utterly transformed the United States by World War II in a really short period of time. If you look at all sorts of social, technological, medical advances, they occurred in World War II, and we are still benefiting not only from the freedom that all of these guys gave their lives for, but also from the advances that were made in the United States. Well, I can only really talk about World War II. Misconceptions about serving in the US Army. I think perhaps one of the misconceptions we have is that everybody wanted to do it. You know, most people were drafted. If you knocked on someone's door later on today and said, hey, by the way, would you like to go and serve in combat? Would you like to put your life on the line for other people? Not many people would do that. A lot of people might say they would gladly do that if we were at war, but that wasn't the case in World War II. After Pearl Harbor, yes, an awful lot of Americans rushed to join the US military. But as the war went on and the casualties climbed and more people were killed, people had to be drafted. And they went and served their country willingly, but they didn't enjoy it. What they wanted to do was to come home. That's the thing that they all wanted most. They prayed that they would survive, and all they wanted was to come home. They wanted to get the job done, free Europe from Hitler, defeat the Japanese in the Pacific, and then get the hell home. They didn't. I think there's a misconception, if I'm going to answer your question properly, there's a misconception that they were all flying the flag every day, that they were doing this for a greater cause, that they were very, very happy to lay down their lives for their fellow Americans. That actually wasn't the case. Many people, yes, were very patriotic, but basically they all wanted to just do their duty and get home. And I think one of the great things about the memorial where we're standing here is that hardly any World War II veterans come here anymore, because there's hardly any World War II veterans alive, and most of them can't walk without assistance. And so what you get now, which I think is wonderful here, is if you look around, you get a load of school kids who come here and they learn about World War II just by walking here. I mean, they may sit there for half an hour with their feet in the water here, but at least they're in a place where they can think about what World War II was, what it means today. We get a lot of veterans from the Vietnam War that come here. We have honor flights full of Vietnam War veterans that actually come here, and they go to the Vietnam War Memorial. And we get a lot of Iraq, Afghanistan veterans. It's a place where veterans can come and reflect not only on their war, but also World War II. And so I think it's a great place where people can come and connect to a greater cause than themselves, their service to the United States, in whatever war it was that they were involved in. I think they're all veterans who've really seen the sharp end. And you have to remember that even in World War II, it was a small percentage of people that served that actually had to kill or be killed. The front line, people at the edge, who actually went through real hell. And so anybody that's been through that kind of experience and is lucky enough to have survived is marked by that. One of the wonderful things that I think that we don't talk about enough about the so-called greatest generation that fought in World War II is that they were profoundly affected by their experiences. And yet they came home, they didn't complain about it, they didn't go and see therapists, they weren't self-indulgent, they got to work and they built modern America. And they didn't talk about what they'd been through, and they didn't complain or groan or moan about the United States, because they were just lucky. They felt lucky to be alive, and they realized that the people who paid the real price were those that are left behind on the battlefield dead in the Pacific and in Europe. So I think that combat veterans from World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the war on terror, they all have one thing in common, which is that if they've actually served in combat, it has affected them. It's profoundly affected a lot of people. And I don't think that we recognize enough how much they need to be listened to, understood, helped, supported, and celebrated in a way that goes beyond just saying thank you for your service. We need to actually start to really understand what sacrifices they've really made. Their psychological health, their physical health, the well-being of their families, their spouses, what they've actually given to this country, often in unimaginable circumstances. And so it's not enough just to say thank you for your service. we have to actually say, we understand you, we're listening to you, we're going to support you, we're going to give you proper benefits, we're going to help your families, we're going to give you the best education you can get, we're going to help you transition from the military into civilian life in the best way possible. You know, the greatest gift that you can give anyone is to give your life for them. And we have people that have always served in the US Army who have been ready to give their lives for other people. Now, if someone's going to do that for me so that I can sleep peacefully at night, then that person needs to be paid really well, honored, respected, looked after, not just when they're in uniform, but for the rest of their lives. This is an amazing celebration of an incredibly complex, fascinating, very, very diverse country. And the fact that it's survived for 250 years, that we have this amazing experiment in democracy that continues to this very day, that you have this republic that is the model for many other democracies and republics around the globe. The fact that it's worked is a miracle in itself. So I think we need to celebrate the fact that it's lasted so long, that it has worked. It still exists after 250 years. But we also have to celebrate the forces that have protected that democracy in our direst, darkest moments. We have to celebrate the men in uniform and women in uniform who have now, for well over 2 centuries, been prepared to serve a cause greater than themselves, i.e. the Constitution and the United States of America. They should go to the website of Friends of the National World War II Memorial, because we have a ton of videos, a lot of pieces that I write, a lot of information. We have really great social media outreach. So if you're looking for a one-stop resource on World War II, go to Friends of the National World War II Memorial. I'm the historian for them, so obviously I would say that, but actually it's a really good place to start. I'd like to remind all Americans of what it was like to be in a concentration camp in 1945 when Americans liberated Dachau, Buchenwald and others. I'd like to remind Americans of what it felt like to be an enslaved European after 6 years of pure evil and hell and enslavement. I'd like to remind Americans of why Western Europe is free today. I'd like to remind Americans of what was built after World War II, a system globally that has worked. I'd like to remind Americans that the US Army and other armed forces gave this country the greatest respect it's ever enjoyed in its entire history after World War II. This was the most respected country on the planet because everybody around the world that actually knew what had really happened in World War II, they understood that Americans were prepared not only to die for their own freedom, but for millions and millions and millions of other people's freedom. People like me, not even born. America had walked it like it had always talked it. It was the real deal. And so, in large part, the freedom of Europe, the freedom of many parts of this globe, came down to young Americans fighting to destroy fascism, totalitarianism, and untold evil.